Today's daf we're going to be learning is Yoma daf Lamed Gimel. This week's shiurim are sponsored by Leslie Glassberg Nadel and Don Nadel in memory of the Yurtzites of their mothers, Teresa Glassberg, Tova Bat Zvi Hirsch on Rosh Chodesh Sivan, and Rhoda Nadel, Zisarisa Bat Aliyah Cohen on the 2nd of Sivan. We are now going to start from the third line of Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph, Abaye Misader Ma'aracha Mishmei de Gemara. So Abaye, we already learned this section once before. We talked about it last time that we say it in the tefillah in the morning if you say the section about the sacrifices. And he would explain, according from a tradition, this is what he heard. Ba'aliba de Abba Shaul, this is according to the interpretation of Abba Shaul. If you remember, we saw there was a big machloket, and he was one of the people that lived at the end of the time of the Beit HaMikdash and had knowledge of what went on inside, and this was his tradition. The way they're going to organize this list is this comes before this comes before that. I put it on your sheet in a way that maybe organized a little better for the way you or I might visualize things a little bit differently than the way they say it, where I just made a list of what the order is. We're going to see 15 things. So it starts with the Maracha Gdola, that's arranging the wood on the altar. Then the Maracha Shniya Shel Ktoret. Then there's another small pile. Okay, if you look at the map, my map here, you can see that on the altar, okay, there's the tapuach. The tapuach, remember that circle in the middle where you put all the ashes? There's a large wood pile. Okay, that's on the east side. And on the western side, over there on the same spot, is the incense wood pile. Okay, there was another pile, and then there was also the perpetual fire. That is on the other side, but that we're not discussing right now. We're discussing the Maracha Gdola and the Maracha Ktana. So there was a small one where they would take the coals from there, if you remember, we talked about it, and put it on the altar, and the inside, they would bring from there a pan filled with coals in order to bring it in to do the incense. So that's the second thing they would do in the morning. Then Maracha Shniya Shel Ktoret, Kodemet L'Sidor Shnei Gzirei Eitzim. After that, you do the two logs that you put on top of the big altar. Okay, on top of the pile of wood that goes, right, warp woof. We've discussed it before. Then, right, the crisscross. On top of that, you put two logs. So that comes third. Then we have Sidor Shnei Gzirei Eitzim Kodem L'Dishum Mizbeach HaPnimi. That comes before you do, meaning the next thing you do is clean out the inner altar. V'Dishum Mizbeach HaPnimi Kodem L'Hatavat Chamesh Nerot. Then you clean the 5 candles out. Remember, we split this into 2, 5 and 2. We're going to get into that a little bit more today and next stuff. If you remember, there was a big machloket between Abba Shaul and the other opinion about what activity, what's the action that separates. So we're in Abba Shaul right now. It's the blood of the tamid. You do then the sprinkling of the blood, and then you go back to Dam Tamid Kodem La Tavat Shtei Nerot. Then you finish the other 2 candles. So we split the 5 and 2. Talk about later why we split it. And then in between you do the sprinkling of the blood of the Korban Tamid. Tavat Shtei Nerot Kodem L'Ktoret. So the next thing you do is the Ktoret. Remember, there was also a debate about that. Remember, it says in the pasuk, it's on your sheet. Shmot Lamed pasuk Zayin V'Iktira La Aron Ktoret Samim Baboker Beitivot Hanerot Yaktirena. Some people say Bativot Hanerot. First you do that, then yaktirena. And then we saw there was a different opinion that said first you burn it, the incense, and you clean the candles while the incense is smoking up. But that's not what this Tana says. That's not what Abba Shaul says. Uktoret kodem le'evarim. After the ktoret, then you do the evarim. You bring the body parts onto the altar. Ve'evarim lemincha. Then you do the mincha nisachim. Mincha lechavitin. Then you do the special Kohen Gadol's mincha. Right, that's not connected with the Korban Tabid. It's just something the Kohen Gadol had to bring twice a day. That's why we say he had to be wealthy to afford this. The chavitim l'nisachin. After the chavitim, you do the nisachim. Okay, you do the libations. Unisachin l'musafim. Then if there's, now we start getting into, after we finish the regular stuff, and this is probably based on tadir v'sheno, tadir kodem. First you do all the usual. Then the special things, if there's korbanot musaf that day, additional sacrifices like Rosh Chodesh, holidays, then you do them. Musafin lebizichin. Then you do, if it's Shabbat, you then put out the 2 bowls of frankincense that go with the bread. Ubizichin letamid shel bein ha'arbaim. Those go before you do the afternoon sacrifice, and that we're going to see why in a minute. Shenemar v'iktir aleha chal be'ashlamim. which they darshaned, and we've seen this drasha before. Aleha hashlem kol hakorbanot kulam. We learned this in Pesachim. Because remember the time, when do you do the korban pesach in the afternoon? What's supposed to be the last thing you do? Generally, we do the korban tamid last, right? There's an exception, and we do pesach after. But it has to be an exception because generally that's supposed to be, right? On it, hiktir aleha means on it, you should finish everything, meaning that should be the last major activity you do in the temple. Amar Mar. So now we're going to go in depth into all these things. So why do we do the first one? Minalan. Why does that come first? Ditanya. Okay, now we're going to quote a pasuk. Shneimar. Sorry, it doesn't say Shneimar. Hi ha'olam mokdal mizbeach kol halayla. Okay, let's look at the whole verse. It's from Vayikra Vav pasuk Bet. Okay, I brought it on the sheet. Tzavet Aaron ubanav lemor zot Torat ha'olah. This is how you do the korban olah. Hi ha'olah al mokdal mizbeach kol halayla ad haboker. Right? This goes on all night until the morning, and the light of the altar, the fire of the altar is gone. So they say, what's hi ha'olah al mizbeach kol halayla? That's Zomar Chagdola. It's on the big base. Be'esh hamizbeach tu kabo Zomar Chashniya Shel Ktoret. The pasuk ends and it says, well, there's also the Esh hamizbeach is always there. That must be talking about the second one, which is the one of the Ktoret. So they say, therefore, we say first comes before second because look at the order in the verse. To which the Gemara says, Epochana, why'd you come up with that order? You could say the order is the opposite. So, well, mistabra maracha gdola adifa sheken kaparata meruba. The big one is used mostly for all the sacrifices to receive atonement. So therefore, as opposed to the other one, which was used for the incense. So therefore, it must be that one's more important. So they say, adraba, but I could give you the other logic. Maracha shniya adifa sheken machnisim mimena lifnim. The maracha shniya is more important because you bring from the fire there into the hechal, into the sanctuary, which is much more sanctified. So they say, afilu hachi kaparatam meruba adifa. They say, no, it's still better, the one that's outside, even though it's outside, it still is the one that atones for most of all the sins. Alternatively, you could say, here's an interesting argument. They say, imagine if for whatever reason there was no wood on the maracha shniya. Wouldn't you take from the maracha gdola? You wouldn't say, oh, today we're not doing ktoret because there's no fire. So therefore, it must be that the first fire is the main one. And because in the event that you don't have, you must take from there. Now, by the way, they don't prove from anywhere that we know that you would. They just think it's obvious because imagine if for whatever reason you didn't have the small fire going, of course you would use the bigger fire. You wouldn't say, I'm not doing incense today. So, which shows that it's not essential because you can use the other one, and that's why that one comes first. Now let's go to the next one. So the ktoret, the second, the fire for the ktoret comes before you put the two logs on. Minalam, where do we get this from? Dichtiv, as it says in the pasuk, ubi'er aleh kohen etzim baboker baboker. Okay, this is from pasuk Hey in that same chapter, in chapter 6. Ha'esh ala mizbeach tu kabo. V'lo tichbet will never go out. Ubi'er aleh kohen etzim baboker baboker. And every morning he needs to come bring them. So what do you see? Aleha, which means put it on there. Put the two logs on the maracha gdola. And where not? Well, it has to say aleha because it's saying put it there and don't put it on the maracha ktana, which makes it sound like michlal de'ika v'lo chaverta, right? And not on the one next to it. Michlal de'ika lechaverta. That makes it sound like when you put them on this one, don't put on that one. It must be that one was already in existence. And that's how we know that this comes third. Okay, next. So then the Gemara questions. Why don't you just say no? To tell you, you put the logs on top. It's not to tell you on there and not somewhere else. It's to tell you where you put them. So they say, it actually says aleha twice in that pasuk because it says, ubi'er aleha kohen etzim baboker baboker, be'arach aleha ha'olah. So because it says aleha twice, therefore you learn it's got to be also for a drasha. Sidur shnei gzirei etzim, we keep going down the list now. We're actually not going to even finish the list today. Sidur shnei gzirei etzim kodem l'dishum mizbeach hapnimi. So the logs come before the inner altar, cleaning it out. V'af agav dehachaktiv baboker baboker. V'hachaktiv baboker baboker. Now there's an assumption of this sugya that the more times it says boker, that means earlier. So because it says baboker by shnei gzirei etzim, and it also says baboker in Shmot Lamed Pasuk Zayin, I also put it on your sheet. B'ktir aleh Aharon ktoret samim baboker, right? He's going to burn on the ktoret. He's going to burn it baboker. Now it's actually talking about burning the ktoret, but we're assuming it also means cleaning it out. There it also says boker, but afilu hachi machshir adif. So they say it's still better. The logs are machshir for the mizbeach. They're getting the mizbeach ready for the sacrifice. That's obviously more important. So they say machshir ma'nihu shnig zirei etzim v'ha'amart shnig zirei etzim limaracha gdola azle. So what the Gemara assumes here is that machshir is actually that you're machshir. They originally thought that when they said it's machshir, it's getting things ready for the k'toret. You can't bring the k'toret on the golden altar unless you have the fire. They're saying the shnei gzirei etzim is getting it ready for the fire. To which the Gemara, this is Rashi's reading of the sugya, to which the Gemara says, but what do you mean? Shnei gzirei etzim is going on the maracha gdola and not for the k'toret. So why are you saying it's machshir for the incense? So Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah shum eitzim. It's the concept that the eitzim prepare things for the k'toret, even though these aren't the same wood that's going into the k'toret, but it's still the same title it has on it. Rav Ashia, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah shum eitzim. Okay, Ravina Amar, he gives a different answer. Ho'il v'yitchil b'ma'aracha gomer. Well, you already started with the maracha, so you finish it. In other words, finish one thing before you go on to the next. So you put the maracha gdola, put the maracha ktana, and then you put the shnei gzirei etzim. Rav Ashi amar, ilo mishkach etzim lemaracha shniya, milo ma'ayel mimaracha gdola. They said if you don't have wood for the etzim, for the maracha shniya, remember for the smaller one, aren't you going to take it from the maracha gdola? Now, what's on the maracha gdola? Is it not shnei gzirei etzim, which means that these gzirei etzim are also going to end up going for the k'toret, and that's why they're going to come first before you actually clean the mizbeach of the k'toret. In other words, something that prepares that altar is more important than the cleaning up of the altar. Now, why does cleaning out for the k'toret come before the candles? Before cleaning out the 5 candles, my time. Good answer. I learned it this way, but I really don't know why. Rava says, I'll give you an answer. Rish Lakish, as Rish Lakish says, the Amar Rish Lakish, Ein ma'abirin ala mitzvot. What does that mean? If a mitzvah comes to you, don't pass up the opportunity. Now, ki aya lehechal mimizbeach paga bereisha. Okay, let's look again. What happens when you walk into the sanctuary? If you remember, you walk in and the first thing you hit is that golden altar. Then when you walk further in, remember we said it's like a triangle shape. You have the menorah and you have the shulchan on opposite sides. So now the first thing you get to is the mizbach haktoret. So you can't pass up the opportunity to do a mitzvah and move on to the menorah. To Tanya, how do we know this? How do we know that that's how it looked? Because there's a brayta that explains shulchan b'tzafon mashuch minakot al shtei amot b'mechzeh. We've seen this before. We saw this, I guess, was in Masechet Shkalim. The shulchan is in the north, from the wall 2.5 cubits into the room. Umenorah b'darom, from the south side, mishucha minakot al shtei amot b'mechzeh, also the same distance from the south wall. Mizbeach memutza ve'omeh be'emtza u'mashuch klapei chutz kima. But the altar is centered in the room in terms of both of those are closer to their own sides, and the altar is in the midpoint of the width of the room, not the length, but the width. And in terms of the length of the room, it's klapei chutz kima, it's closer to the entrance area. V'nukume lahadayu. So now they say, why wouldn't they all just be in a row? Like, the shulchan and the menorah are opposite each other. Why wouldn't you put the altar right in between? Because it says the menorah is facing the table. We have to have them seeing each other. He says, if you say, Rish Lakish says, and that explained to us why the Torah comes before the candles, because that's where you get to first. But in addition, he says, I'm going to learn some other halacha, that you have to put on your tefillin shel yad before you put on your tefillin shel rosh. Your tefillin on your arms, that's dara, is zroa, because dalet and zayin switch in Aramaic. atotfata, the totafot or totafot beinenecha. That's the tefillin on your head. So because the first thing you get to is your arm, your hands are right next to your arm. So you can't pass up the opportunity to do that before you put it on your head. So there, you have to do that before you put it on your head. So ibure darad atotfata asur. It's forbidden to do that. Hechiyavid midara letotfata. You have to do, right? You can't pass over the arm and go to the head. You have to do first the arm and then the head. Which basically means, in other words, split between the two parts of cleaning the candles by putting the blood on the altar of the korban tamid, which, by the way, means you're in the hechal cleaning. Then the next job is outside the hechal. It's not the same person. And then the next job is back inside the hechal. My time, what's the reason for the order? Rabbi, we're going to have a lot of drashot now on this baboker. It's going to be a little confusing because baboker appears a few times, and sometimes it just says boker. You don't need the baboker by the shnei gzirei etzim. Okay, this is the verse we saw before, where it says in Vayikra Vav Pasuk Hey that ubi'er alei kohen etzim baboker. Now you could have just said day. You didn't need to say morning, and you certainly didn't need to say it twice. So they're going to say that this whole thing is unnecessary. Obviously, you do it in the morning because you have to do it before you do everything else, because you need the fire there. So they say that you don't need. Now, when you don't need something, we've learned this before. If it doesn't fit here because you don't need it there, it must be it's coming to teach you about something else. So where are you going to teach it? Well, move it. One you're going to give to the chamesh nerot. And because of that, the chamesh nerot is going to be before the damatamid. Now you might say, why not switch it? And we'll talk about that. If we're already moving it, why are we specifically moving it to there? It's not yet clear. And one put on the damatamid. Now the damatamid, by the way, it says, right? So it's a little confusing because it already says baboker beitivot hanerot yaktirena. Remember, already by the candles, it says two babokers. And by the Dama Tamid, the blood of the korban tamid, if you remember, very famous pasuk, it says, "Et hakeves ha'echad taseh baboker, et hakeves hashini taseh ben arbaim." Do one in the morning, one of the animals, and one in the afternoon for the tamid sacrifice. So they say the tamid has one boker, and the tavat shtei nerot has two. But now we're going to add the chamesh nerot, and now we're going to add another one to each. So you're going to have 3 for the 5 candles and 2 for the korban tamid. And that's why the 5 candles comes first. So let's read this inside. So they say again, right, and one goes to the dama tamid, that it's going to go before the 2 candles because it now has 2 babokers. So chad shad yalat havat chamesh nerot deliktem le dama tamid. Why? It's a numbers game, like I said. There's already 2 babokers. Now it gets a third, the candles. And the keves ha'echad, the korban tamid, only have 1, and now it gets an additional. So it's 3 versus 2. The chad shadia the dama tamid deniktame lahatavat shtei nerot. The afagav the hachatre v'hachatre. Now it's true. The hatavat shtei nerot didn't get any extra, but it still is connected with that verse about baboker beitivot hanerot. So it's got 2 bokers. And the keves now has 2 bokers, even though there's only 1 in the verse. It got this extra one from the gzirei etzim that were extra. So even though they're both 2. Mechaper adif, we'd rather give priority to the dama tamid because that provides atonement, whereas the candles don't. So Amalei Rav Papa Labai. Now he starts to question, why are you choosing to give the extra babokers of the shnei gzirei etzim of those 2 lags, 1 to the candles and 1 to the tamid? Why don't you say why don't you say 1 goes to cleaning out that inner altar and to teach you that comes before the dama tamid? Because also by the Ktoret, the pasuk about baboker v'tzivon hanerot yaktirena, the baboker applies both to the candles and actually both to the 5 and to the 2, and it also applies to the incense. So maybe you would say, give an extra one to the yishom mizbeach pnimi, and that proves why that comes before the blood of the korban tamid. V'chad shadia the dama tamid deniktom latavat chamesh nerot, and then give an extra one to the dama tamid, which will now be 2. And that will stand opposite the candles, which are 2. But it'll be better than the candles because, again, even they're both 2, mechaper adif. So he's basically saying it sounds like the dama tamid theoretically, you could switch around this drasha. Give the Shnei Gzirei Eitzim, one to the Dishonim Mizbeach HaPnimi, one to the Dama Tamid, none to the candles, and then the Dama Tamid will have two. The candles will have two, and now the blood of the Tamid will override because it's got atonement, which weighs it down, right? It gives it more weight. So why don't we say that? Im Kain, if then we'll be stuck though, what will happen? So our order will be Dishon Mizbeach HaPnimi, Dama Tamid, and then we'll have the Chamesh Nerot, and then we'll have the Shtei Nerot. Now, the whole thing we said was that there's a break between the 5 and the 2. So if we do this, then there's nothing splitting up the candles, and we need something to split the candles. Now, we don't really know why we do, but we'll see that right now. So we're going to have a machlok at Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, why we split the candles 5 and 2, or at all why we split them. Then we'll get to 5 and 2 at the end. But Rish Lakish says, why do we do it twice? We want to make a lot of action. So first we do 5, then we do 2, so that there's more people around, because some people do the 5, other people do the 2, right? A different person does each. We want to have activity. We've seen this before. And now we say, and therefore, because that's the case, Shapir, it makes sense. You don't really need anything in between. You just need different people, things going on. There's one stage and then there's another stage. That creates a feeling of action. But Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Baboker, Chalkeu L'Shnei B'Karim, Ma'ika L'Meimer. He says the Baboker comes to tell you, split it in 2. Therefore, split it means you need a break in between both. So what are you going to say? So Amalei Ravina Rav Ashi, Hi Baboker De'etzim Mimi Yatir. Says, wait a minute. Ravina says to Rav Ashi, the Baboker of the Shnei Gzirei Eitzim, who says it's extra? Maybe you need it for its own sake. You need to know that it comes before the Marach HaShniyah of the Ktoret. Maybe you would say, now we don't say that. Remember, the Ktoret comes first, but maybe they're saying, maybe we should say Baboker is coming to say that actually comes earlier than the second Maracha, the second pile. So they say, Amar Lav mi ukma ale velo chavertam nichlal deika lechaverta. But we already proved that we don't do that because it says put on it, meaning it and not its friend, meaning the Marach HaShniyah must be there already. So that's why we know that Baboker doesn't need to be there. So then they say, Ma'ishna de'avid hatavat shnei ro pereisha, ne'avid hatavat shtei nerot pereisha. So now he says, just one second, I'm going to check one thing. I just wanted to check that what I wanted to point out, we actually switched questions when Ravina asked Rav Ashi, but we didn't really answer how we explain it according to Rabbi Yochanan. There's really no answer. Okay, just so you know, they leave that with a question. So they have a question where Rav Papa says, because Rav Papa had this suggestion, and then we basically said it doesn't really make sense because then you're going to end up the 5 candles are with the 2 candles, and that can't be according to Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore we reject what Rav Papa said. So now back to our topic. We have one other question now, or maybe 2. Why don't we do 2 and then 5? So they say, since you already started, and now we're going to see why we do 5 and 2, you do the majority. So they say, if you want to do most of them, why don't we do all 6 then and leave 1 over for later? So no, Amar Krab, the pasuk says nerot in plural, so there always have to be hatavat nerot plural. So you need minimum 2. So let's do the majority first, then do the Dama Tamid because of Baboker split it in 2, as Rabbi Yochanan said, or as Rish Lakish said, we want to just have different things going on in activity, so make it 2. But once we split 2, we need at least 2 candles on 1, and then we do the majority, though the 5 in the beginning. Batavat nerot kodemet laktoret. So now we're moving back on the list. This is what I mentioned before, that there's 2 ways to read that verse. Abba Shaul reads it as first the nerot, then the ktoret. Uktoret le'evarim. Why ktoret comes before evarim? Ditanya. Yukdam davar shenemar baboker baboker. Because remember, the ktoret also, yaktirena, comes in that same verse of baboker. That's going to come before davar shelo ne'emar bo ela boker echad bilvad. Where's the boker achad by the evarim? It's the same boker at the keves echad taseh baboker. Anything related to the animal is 1 boker. And that's why the ktoret comes before the putting the limbs on the altar. Okay, we'll stop here. We'll get tomorrow to evarim l'mincha, and we'll continue on in the list why everything comes before everything else. With that, we will finish for today and pick up there tomorrow.